So, welcome back to another Half and Half Scarf football podcast with me, Nick, and my mate Dom. Very briefly, for those who don't know and they're joining late, this is episode 13. And as a result of that, we'll give you a bit of a backstory. Dom and I are both middle of the season ticket holders, met at the Riverside about 12 years ago, 10, 12 years ago. I can't really remember exactly. But Dom's also a season ticket holder at Everton. This is a non-partisan podcast. It's not about Middlesbrough and Everton, although we do take our football viewing seriously and we do reference that as we go through. We like to talk about topics that we think the football fans are interested in and that they're talking about in the pub, in the concourse, on the way to and from the match. And one such subject, which is episode 13 today, is we're going to talk about multi-club ownership and the phrase sports washing. And I'd like to thank Steve Atkinson, amongst others actually, who suggested this as a subject that is vexing quite a few people and fans of clubs who either maybe don't understand it or have been hard done by, and certainly Palace would fit into that category. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to my co-host, Dom, and as ever, we always have a quick chat about, for those who are watching YouTube, the shirts of choice. We're both in Hummel today, mate.
We are. Hey, Nick, can't believe it's episode 13. Got to get it in there. Can't believe it's episode 13. Andy, that's just for you again. This will become boring, but, we'll keep going with it. Shirts today, we're both wearing Hummel. I'm wearing the one from the 1920 season, I think it is.
I think this is the away version from the same season, mate.
It is, mate. Yeah, I really like this home shirt. It's a play on the classic one from the 87, 88, 88, 89 season that Skill did. And it's a play on that with the red and white stripes at the top of the shirt. Also rolls into that what we were saying in the previous pod back in the day, mate, when we were saying, sometimes it's nice to go against the usual band or the usual what you expect from your home shirt. And This is one of them. I think it's a really nice kit.
Excellent. My favourite, I always like the blue and black stripes. I like our away kit this year. It's got a red in between. This is the very simple blue and black stripe, a classic Borough away kit. It fits well in terms of the styling. I wore this at my 60th birthday party that you came to in our local club. We had a football themed birthday party, and I had this on. I changed shirts a few times, and a guy came up to me and he'd had a few beers. He went, "That's a class shirt, that, mate. Can I buy that from you?" So he clearly loved it as well. So anyway, enough of that. We talk about shirts for those on YouTube, but those who are listening only, I'm sorry, we'll bore the pants off you. So we're going to start with multi-club ownership, and we'll get to the sports washing thing. And I think the phrase you used off air as we were just doing a bit of prep, and people might be surprised that we do a bit of prep, to be fair, when they listen to this, but you used the phrase murky, and I think it's fair to say it is a world that I don't think anyone, probably some specialists at the Athletic and places like that, proper journalists really understand the nuances of it all. But to match-going football fans like us, it feels wrong. We don't kind of know why, but we want to explore what we feel feels wrong. Is that fair, Dom?
I think that's fair, Nick. Yeah, I think that's a good summary, mate. Yeah.
So I've got a list of multi-club ownership groups as of 2025, and it absolutely shocked me. There are 26 global multi ownership groups, most of whom have got at least one Premier League. They've only got one, but we've got a Premier League club in there. At the top is City Group with 12 clubs, Red Bull Soccer with 8, Global Football Holdings with 7, and then there's 2 with 6, ACAP and Pacific Media Group, and then loads more with 5, 5, 4, 4, 2. My earliest memory and awareness of multi-club ownership goes back to the Pozzo family at Watford and Udinese. They've been around for ages. It always seemed a bit odd to me, the Watford would sign a Udinese player, then they'd send a player on loan to Udinese, then it'd all be a bit kind of, strange in terms of where the players came from and how late they arrived in the window. What was that? Your first awareness of sort of the multi-club thing? Was that a similar thing?
Yeah, it was. It definitely was, and they'd always kind of talk about we can use this as a way of sharing players, sharing best practices, etc., etc. And it's like, well, that's a load of nonsense because you haven't got any best practices. The way you manage Watford is an absolute joke. I mean, behind the scenes, it might run really well, which is great if it does. But in terms of management and a stable structure and a settled structure for the fans to buy into and get behind someone, that's never been their plan. And I mean, in fairness, they admit it, that's not their plan. But it's still not great in terms of being a match going fan. But that was definitely my first awareness of it. And I did find it quite odd. It's like, well, I don't really think there's any best practices to get from Udinese and Watford. It's almost like, well, why suddenly do that? There's none. It's just that you own both clubs. So there's no best practices and things you can share from each other. It just happens that you own it. And you hear that. I think you could hear that in other instances of buying clubs and things like that. But I think that's gone by the wayside. I mean, you can have affiliates with clubs and, do all of that kind of thing without having to buy a club. And you can, clubs are doing that all the time now. So I think the buying of the clubs now is much more in terms of it benefits the actual group who own them in terms of the financial side of it.
You hit the nail on the head there from a football point of view. It's not really about football, like everything these days, that is spoiling the game. It's all appears to be very much so about money. Now, the reality of the money situation is, one of my favourite ever football films is The Damned United. It's not because, Leeds struggled under Cloughy and whatever. I just think it's a brilliant film. I love the sort of the whole concept of that. Yeah. But I love the guy, I can't remember his name, famous British actor who played the chairman of Derby County, and he's Cloughy's got the players running up and down the steps, and the chairman's like, who the hell's that? He says, it's Colin Todd. Who signed him? Cloughy said, I have. It's my club, it's my money, you're overstepping the mark. And I love the fact that, football used to be owned by chairmen who were local business people who, either wanted the vanity of owning a football club. They certainly weren't in it for the money, were they? Going back historically, nobody who owned a local football club made any money out of it at all. They were like a money pit, weren't there? And you just got to look at Steve Gibson at Borough. He's bankrolled Middlesbrough since '86 to the tune of significant amounts of his own money over the years. But he's a proper chairman, a proper fan, and highly respected by Borough fans. But the multi-ownership thing just takes all of that away, doesn't it?
It does. I agree with you, and I would possibly argue, mate, that the owners of all these clubs would say, "Well, no, they're all individually owned. They all have their own chairman and everything like that." Etc. Well, I don't agree with that at all, because ultimately there's someone overseeing the whole thing, who's in charge. So they're all intrinsically linked. They're all intrinsically linked financially, and I just don't think it does mean that you've got like a separate entity anymore, a separate club. There must be reasons why they're doing it. I mean, City own all kinds of unusual clubs. From the likes of a really solid, brilliant club in Girona in Spain to random clubs in Japan and all over the place, in the Australian A-League. Yeah. I know they rebranded one. I think it might have been the Australian one. Correct me if I'm wrong, anyone who's listening, but they did rebrand one, and at the time changed their colours to sky blue, which I felt was just stripping the identity of that team. I don't know if the fans would have been bothered, or if they were a struggling team, perhaps jumping from the rooftops thinking, "Yay, this is fantastic. We're going to be part of City Group. We're going to be something huge." Now, I don't know, but that concerned me at the time. I'm not quite sure how if that ever goes on now in terms of. I don't think it really does. So I come back to Murky, mate, because I don't know anything or too much about it. I just know that it's starting to cause quite a few conflicts of interest, issues. Look at the Palace situation in terms of what happened there with the multi-club ownership. But also, if you look at Palace, you could argue it's probably a good example of where maybe they do own more than one club, but perhaps it does work well in certain situations. Palace seem to me to be a well-run club, and they've gained a good bit of success over the last few years in terms of just punching above their weight. The players they're bringing in, players are able to sell on. won the FA Cup. They're in Europe, so you could say, well, is the multi-club ownership anything? Is it to the detriment of the clubs? Is it making the clubs poorer? Are they less focused on the clubs? I don't think there's any evidence of that. I just think it's the financial aspect behind it all, which is what bothers me and what's murky about it, really.
Yeah, the bit about Palace, though, the question I would have is how many of the players and how much of the success that Palace have created is anything to do with the other six? They've got six others in their group at
Mm.
Global Football Holdings. I don't think from looking at the Palace squad and the Palace team that much of that on-field success is attributed to the other six in the group. I
No,
think it might be financially that they're more
yeah,
stable and they've
yeah,
got more money to play with. They certainly seem they are a brilliantly well-run club, but it's come back and bitten them in the arse, hasn't it? Because
yeah,
they rightly qualified for the Europa League, and then were demoted to the Europa Conference, and Forest were promoted to the Europa League on that basis. Now, if I was a Palace fan, initially I'd be absolutely really peed off by that because I think, well, we've qualified by rights. And actually, if you look at the Red Bull teams, for example, I'm sure that various Red Bull teams, Salzburg and RB Leipzig, etc., I'm sure they've played in the same competition. I'm sure they'll have played in the Europa League or the Champions League qualifiers or whatever it
yeah,
might be. So there seems to be one rule for one and one rule for others. And the further down the big club food chain you go, the more you get kind of pissed on. I think is I don't think City would have ever been demoted to a different competition if they were in a multi-club situation with somebody else. I just think they would it just wouldn't happen to them. But the likes of Palace, oh well, you haven't been in Europe for either ever or for a long time. I can't remember. Apologies, Palace,
yeah.
but oh well, well we can just trample all over you because we'll make the rules suit for you. And that's the murkiness of that as well, the inconsistency of it, really.
I think so, mate. Yeah, and Palace were raising that as such at the time, weren't they? They said the decision was inconsistent and unfair, and they couldn't really fully justify why it had been taken. I think if you can fully evidence and confirm that it's not going to be a conflict of interest, then if you're running your clubs well and they're run separately, surely they should be able to be in both in the same competition at the same time. That for me is more the key point there. I don't really see how them both being in there is cheating anybody. I don't think there's any issue in terms of sporting integrity. There's no advantage being gained. You can't look at the two of them and think, oh, well, they're both owned by the same group, therefore there's going to be issues there that they're going to have an advantage in terms of how we perform and how we play. I don't see any of that being an issue.
No.
So I'm not quite sure whether FIFA, UEFA are now blurring the lines and confusing it because they're getting more involved in it, and then it's more inconsistent in terms of how they're applying their rules. More so, maybe it's because, like anything else, it's happening more. So there's more owners, they own more clubs, and therefore they then start delving into, well, what does that actually mean? But I'd be more concerned personally at the moment with the Strasbourg Chelsea situation than I would be with the Leon and Palace situation. It's just it, yeah. It's and as you made a good point there. If you were a Palace fan now, would you be livid at your club for being owned? Having a multi ownership. Would you be livid with your owners, or are you just looking and thinking, well, actually, the owners haven't done anything wrong here. This is down to the governing bodies, or does it come into our? I think we have to keep using this word today. Is it the murkiness of the whole situation because nobody actually knows if there's anything of issue.
Well, I think it's weird because the multi-ownership groups would claim that they're individually managed and owned, and therefore, if they are individually managed and owned, then there is no advantage. But
Yeah,
then when UEFA or FIFA look at it, they'll go, but you're part of a multi-ownership group, and therefore you're not individually owned. Therefore, you have a group chair or a group board or whatever it might be. So therefore, it is unfortunately, breaking the rules, such as they are, the rules that they make up as they go along. I think, but the reality is they can't have it both ways, can they? They either are or they're not getting some advantage by being part of the group. The only advantage I can see, and it comes back to everything, and we are madly passionate about doing the right thing for the fans, right? It's now to do with
yeah,
fans. It's to do with money, isn't it? It's literally to do with money. It's a money making, money washing, it feels to me like they can do stuff between the clubs that is just on the edge of like kind of
illegality.
yeah.
But
Is it morally right, legally right? It might be legally okay, but morally, the transfer in place. You mentioned Strasbourg and Chelsea, so Ben Chilwell. Talk to me about Ben Chilwell. Your view on that?
so we have to be careful in how we say this. For all I know, Ben Chilwell might want to go to Strasbourg. Liam Rossini is there. They had a good season last season, playing well. He might want to go there. Change of lifestyle, play regular first team football, get himself elevated and back out there. For all we know, Ben Chilwell might really want to go to Strasbourg. But then the other side of it is, does he? Does he? Because they're owned by Chelsea. So is that nicely convenient that they just took him off and pass him off to Strasbourg for a year? Does he want to play for Strasbourg?
Yeah.
Maybe there's been little interest in him. I don't really know. But then you're kind of thinking, if he doesn't want to go, how is he incentivized to go? So there's I think Steve, who raised this point on the in the group as well. He was talking about how there's been players sold from Chelsea to Strasbourg and then bought back,
Yeah.
but bought back in such a way where you're thinking that's very odd. Why are you doing that? And that's where you start to feel that's the again coming into the murkiness of it. Is there a sports washing thing there? Is there a money issue there? Is it we're
Yeah.
getting around a loophole financially to make money by swapping players around and selling them and re-signing them? And in terms of the actual players, what control do they have in that situation? Are they on board with this? Are their agents on board with it? Are they getting incentivized to do it? It just feels wrong, mate, to be honest. It just
Yeah.
doesn't feel right. And I think it raises question marks for me because I sometimes I'm also like an Everton fan. We've just been taken over by the Freaking Group. They own Roma. I sometimes wonder, further down the line, does that does that create problems if all of a sudden we're in the same competition and we're, vying for the same title and stuff like that? Should it matter if you run correctly and the clubs are all, even though they've got like an overarching owner, if they're run independently, is there any integrity issues, or are the owners rooting for one more than another in terms of a
Well,
financial incentive or what that means for something? I don't know is the answer. I don't know enough. So it does give you some level of concern thinking, is there something we don't know where maybe if we were ever pitched together in a competition, the owners might want something more from one team or gain something more?
that
I don't
that
know. I don't know.
that that might be the protective issue that UEFA or FIFA are putting on board
Yeah,
a scenario. Let's take that fantasy of yours then, that Everton going deep into European
it is a
competition.
fantasy,
Okay,
but
yeah.
it will happen. It will. I keep telling myself it'll happen. I tell my daughter all the time, mate, so I've got to believe it. And I do believe it, to be honest. I do believe it. It will
Okay.
happen.
So the fantasy of Everton going deep into a
Yeah,
competition and play, I'll come back to that, and playing Roma again. Roma, a giant of Italian football. They've only won one European competition. That was under Mourinho, wasn't it? Recently, they won
yeah.
the conference or the Europa League.
Conference
But
League, yeah, it was.
yeah, but there is that situation that would arise at that point. If that's a group ownership, is there a better financial result for the group for one or the other winning it? Would there be
Yeah,
a better outcome? That because let's be fair, the group won't care about anything apart from money because they're not buying these football clubs for the altruism of being a Man City fan or a Roma fan or an Everton fan or a Crystal Palace fan. They're not local owners with local history. They don't, they're buying it because there's a financial incentive of some sort. So I think there is that challenge further down the line. And maybe that's why Palace and Lyon weren't allowed in the same competition, because it wasn't clear to the authorities in UEFA in this instance as to whether there was something murky that would happen if they were drawn together, in the knockout phase or whatever it might be. We don't know, but it's because we don't know that everybody thinks it's murky. I've talked to lots of fans about multi-club ownership, and you know what? The ones who love it, funnily enough, are the ones who are in it. So you like see your Man City fans, Newcastle. Oh, hey, listen, Newcastle fans could not wait to celebrate being owned by PIF, right? They could not wait to celebrate being the richest club in the world. Now, they've not been able to do much with that because of, financial fair play or whatever they call it these days. But they threw all their morals out the window, didn't they, when they said, "Oh, we're owned by, the Saudi PIF group. We don't care about all sorts of other things that are dark and murky about that group, etc. We're just a rich club now." So it's funny how your morals change when you become the owned club. Has it
Yeah.
changed you? Has it changed your thoughts on Everton that you're owned by somebody? Yours is less murky because there's only a couple of clubs involved, but you get to PIF level, you get to City Group level, it's just a bit of a mess, isn't it?
Well, I think the owners might turn around and say it's not. They might just say, actually, no matter how many clubs we own, we can demonstrate how transparent we are. You could argue that with the Freaking Group and owning only two clubs, they've still got holdings all over the place, or it might be this part of the group that owns the club, or this part of the group that owns the club. I mean, the Freaking organization is huge. They're into so many different industries, and they're into film. They're in. I mean, I think the Freaking group initially made their money from car dealerships and things like that.
Yeah.
Uh, and it's grown from there. I mean, they're into everything. They are a really big organization. I think for me as a fan watching it, my concern is, do foreign owners, when they come in and say they really care about a community, they really want to kind of do right by the club's values and retain those, do they? I would. I know, like you just said there, is it all about them? It's just about the money. The likelihood is it is, but I still have this romanticized idea that, is it, rich people who, like a kid in a sweet shop, do love sports and think, well, I love sports, I love football, I
Yeah.
want to own a really good club and I want to do right by that club. And if I honestly have to say, mate, if I was that rich and I was a huge football fan, if I knew I could do it and I could own a club and run it the right way, I would. But I would absolutely want to do it integral to that community, get to know that community, that fan base. And if I knew that my club was run like that and was going to be run like that, I'd have no problem in who owns it if they're clear and transparent about it. I think it's time will tell with that whether that's going to be the case. They've owned Roma for a bit longer, but whether we'll actually ever know, I don't know, because these owners play their cards close to their chest, don't they?
Well, and that's the other thing, and quite rightly, I guess legally, morally, and from a due diligence point of view, they do play the cards close to the chest. It's their right to do so, but it's because they play the cards close to the chest. It's the lack of transparency that worries football fans. I will say, in defence of City Group, by the way, that City Group have done nothing but fantastic things for the community around the Etihad in terms of
Yeah.
what they've built, what they've done, the investment they've made in the women's team, the infrastructure, the whole kind of network of training facilities, etc. But the big argument comes from the fact that they've thrown a shed load of money at buying success. Abramovich did that first of all, but he did that off his own back. Money is the root of it all, isn't it? Really, the more money you've got, the more success you can have, the more you can become a global brand and whatever. Which I guess is all part of being something bigger than a one club kind of facility.
Yeah, I think so, mate. And going back to the Newcastle situation, I think at the time they suddenly thought they were going to be able to do what Man City did, and just bulldoze everything and go from being a club that had been really struggling to being a real powerhouse again. I get why their fans were really excited about it. I I would have been less so if, as a fan of Newcastle, being owned by a country. That does bother me quite a lot, actually.
Yeah,
I wouldn't be happy with that if it was Everton or Middlesbrough. I'd be really unhappy about it. I'd still be a fan. I'd get on with it, but it really would worry me being owned by a country. But I think what suddenly became the realization for Newcastle, and this is where there's lots of criticism about the PSR and stuff like that, but there needs to be something that comes into football to regulate how big you can become. I know there's lots of arguments of, if you're a big club and your revenue's huge, you should be able to spend whatever percentage of your revenue and on players and everything else. But I don't really agree with that analogy. I think that just means that the bigger you are and the more money you make, the bigger you become, the more powerful you become, the more you can bulldoze everyone below you.
Yeah.
I do think this needs to be, and I can see why the Premier League are trying to do this, where there needs to be rules involved to um, curb that, really, because that's the other thing is, um, you know, I wouldn't have an issue with and the reason I'm making this point is I wouldn't have an issue with multi-club ownership if there's rules in place that really make it so actually there's no financial advantage. There's just multi-club ownership because these conglomerates, or people want to own them, but actually that's not the case at the moment. They are doing it because there's financial gains in being able to do that. It's pure and simple.
The other thing that goes with that, though, is how you present your revenue generation. So things like naming rights for stadiums, shirt sponsorship,
Mm-hmm.
they seem to be getting a shirt sponsorship deal at hugely inflated prices so that they say, all right, that's our revenue. That helps us to buy more players because we've got a massive shirt deal or whatever. And those shirt deals are not necessarily real. The one that Newcastle have got, I can't remember, it's Senna, I can't remember what they call them.
Yeah,
Yeah, would that company really be buying that a shirt sponsorship of a Premier League club if they weren't owned by the same PIF group? It's all murky again in terms of what that number looks like. If that goes on the books, let's say I'll just make up a figure. Shirt sponsorship is 40 million quid. Most shirt sponsorships might be 10 million. They've suddenly got a 40 million pound deal. I've just made those figures up, so I don't want to be sort of quoted on them, but 3 or 4 times the inflated value of what a shirt sponsorship, natural shirt sponsorship deal would be. I think that's murky as well because it says, well, we've got more revenue coming in, so we can spend more money on players. And because they're doing it across a multiple level of clubs within the group, they can get away with that, can't they? We'll say it's more money for Newcastle and slightly less money for somebody else in the group, or we'll just make a massive donation across the group, but we'll call it
yeah,
shirt sponsorship. It just feels a bit hard to measure.
yeah. That's a good example. I mean, and I know, and let's be clear, everyone. He's using this as an example, aren't you, mate? You're not saying that's actually happening, but it's a really good way of measuring that. Yes, you can do that because if the sponsorship is owned by the same people, they can invest all kinds of money and just say, well, yeah, that's what they want to pay for the sponsorship. It's like, yeah, but you own the company, so it is again. It just falls into that remit of, yeah, I'm not quite sure about that. So again, it's like everything, isn't it, mate? There's no clear transparency of what's right and what's wrong, and the financial. It just seems to feel. It feels to me like football over the last 30 odd years has really kind of almost got out of control in terms of what it's become. It's now this huge juggernaut, and the Premier League and the money involved. It's just, I don't really understand why it's all about becoming more and more powerful and making more and more money. I mean, the Premier League is the richest league in the world. It's like the money that the Premier League makes and the clubs make is so astronomically huge compared to other big leagues. Why is it all about making more and more and more and more and more? I don't really understand it.
Well, because that's human nature for power and human nature for financial success, really. But let's look at the model in Germany, the 50+1, okay?
Mhm.
So you look at Bayern Munich. Obviously, we're Dortmund fans and we go and watch Dortmund and whatever. So I'm not a big lover of Bayern Munich, but Bayern Munich are a global. I would put Bayern Munich in the top 5 clubs globally in terms of
Oh, definitely.
easy, in
Yeah.
terms of reach and impact and support base, etc., etc. And yet, because of their 50+1 and because of their financial management, they financially can't compete, can they? People go to Bayern because they want to go to Bayern. They're going to get slightly less wages than they would if they went to a Newcastle, a Man City, a Chelsea, or whatever it might be, because they're not a Premier League club. But I think the 50+1 ownership model is really valid. It's never going to happen over here, obviously, because no one's going to give up that power
Oh,
and
no.
authority.
Yeah.
But I think it helps the balance. The only downside of Germany in the Bundesliga is, apparently culturally, everybody wants to play for Bayern. So if you're a really good player at Leverkusen or even Dortmund or whatever, your ambition is to play for Bayern. So every summer they just pick off the best players for
Yeah.
from the top clubs in Germany and pay a reasonable fee. But their transfer fees internally are a lot more manageable than the transfer fees
Oh
are
yeah.
in the
Yeah.
UK.
Yeah. Yeah. And when Bayern want to make a signature signing, they have to go all out for it. The work they had to do to get Harry Kane over the line in terms of what they paid for him, that was huge for Bayern. I
Yeah.
mean, having said that, though, they still managed to pay 70 million odd for Nicholas Jackson. I'm thinking, wow, that gives them some serious clout. But I think that what that tells you is, and it's clear if you read up on Bayern, their model in terms of how they make their money is just unbelievable. It's so smart. They reward their season ticket holders by charging really cheap prices for season tickets, match going tickets. They
Yeah.
don't penalise their fans. So they have to make their money elsewhere, which is what they do. And other German clubs have to do the same. Bayern, it's probably easy because of who they are. Um, but the money they make in terms of sponsorship deals is just really, really clever. And
Yeah.
that's how they're able to make those big transfers. And even then, they have to really work out if it's in the best interest of them as a club and their team. Like the Harry Kane one was it wasn't a gamble because they knew what they were getting, but they'd never paid 100 million quid for a player before. And then his wages on top of that, I think he's their highest earner by, you know, a huge margin.
Yeah.
So things like that are exceptional for them. Yeah, I would agree. I like the 50+1 model, but there's a few clubs who are circumnavigating that even in Germany where that's a bit difficult now as well in terms of a few of the other ones that aren't quite in line with it. And there's question marks of what kind of advantage they're getting from not being part of that. Go on, mate. Sorry.
Well, going back to that, the model in Germany was broken when RB Leipzig became
Yeah,
RB Leipzig, wasn't it?
yeah,
And they got promoted to the Bundesliga, and in the 8 years they've been in the Bundesliga, they've been in the Champions League space. Apart from last season where they finished eighth,
yeah,
they've been in the top four every season, and they came from nowhere. And funnily enough, in Germany, other fans despise RB Leipzig, and they despise them because they're not the model that everybody else follows.
follows.
So there's a backlash against RB Leipzig, such as there's not a backlash over. There's so many clubs in the Premier League are part of a multi-club ownership that there isn't really a backlash situation. But RB Leipzig stand out as a bit of an outlier, don't they, in Germany? When I've spoken to some German fans about clubs, they would rather Bayern won the league for the 12th time in 13 years than see RB Leipzig have
Yeah, that's
any
true.
success
Yeah,
whatsoever
yeah.
because they don't trust them. They don't trust the ownership. They don't trust the backstory. They don't trust the financials and how it's set up. So that's a really interesting thing. I want to pick up on something that you mentioned earlier about growth and money and all that kind of thing. And I know you can't do this because of human rights laws or probably HR laws or whatever. I would be a fan of having a salary cap across the
Mm,
Premier League. And what I mean by that is not a salary cap in terms of the overall spend for the squad like they have in rugby, where
mm.
there's an overall spend for the squad, but an individual salary cap on individual players because and I know they'd say it's freedom of choice and all that kind of thing, but how much money do you need in your
Yeah,
life?
you actually
If
need. Yeah,
you're earning half a million quid a week, because you've been attracted by half a million quid a week, I just think that's wrong. But only multi club ownership seems to be able to afford those kind of levels. If you look at the financials and look at success, the multi club ownership model is the ones that are rising slowly to the top of each of the divisions, aren't there? Each of the leagues, and it can't be coincidence that it's the murky world of money that's allowing them to do that in some way.
in some way, yeah. I mean, some of these players now they're on. I mean, you've always got your absolute elite players like Messi and Ronaldo, and I know they're not at their peak anymore. But they're, in some level, they're probably still sensational to watch, and
Yeah,
they're kind of. I always class those two as a kind of exception because they've been probably earning the best part of £1 million a week for aeons now, and I know that they're earning that at their current clubs plus all their other sponsorship deals. But then you've got other players that are below those two that are, now pushing 300-400 grand a week, and that's just their wages from their clubs. And I don't know if within that includes their image rights or whether image rights comes on top. I'll take like Jack Grealish for instance, and I'm not, whatever Jack earns and whatever player earns, fine. They've agreed that contract. The club are paying it. I've got no objection to that. They're being offered that money. Would you turn it down? No. Do we know what good would they do with it? No, but they probably do an awful lot of good with it. Hopefully, I'd like to think they would. But Jack Grealish at Everton, for example, the only reason we can afford, I think we're paying 3/4 of his wages. But we've paid like a loan fee of about 12 million for the season.
Yeah.
But that's covering basically the bulk of his wage. So it's how you measure that. I mean, obviously, people go, "Oh, how can we afford that?" It's like, well, we're just paying a loan fee. Would you pay 12 million quid for something like that for a season? Yeah, you would. You can pay more than that, and a player might only stay 2 years.
Yeah.
So does it really matter? But out of that 300 grand a year, I think he's on 300 grand a week. Plus, he's got loads of sponsorship outside of that. So he's probably on 500,000-600,000 a week. I mean, I don't know how much he pays in tax after that, but it is like you say. This is different level money now we're on. This is where it's escalated. From my own back, I remember back in the day, 30 years ago when the Premier League was in its infancy, it was you couldn't believe it when you heard that a player was on like 10 grand a week. You were like, oh my God, now that's like to a penny. That's 10 grand a week's what, good championship players are on. But that does show the gulf. But I'm with you. I think, getting back to the point, I would actually be for a salary cap. And I think a salary cap might work if the salary cap was like you could still earn a really good level, say, I don't know, up to a maximum of like 250 grand a week if you were, that kind of player that deserved it. And there is some players that probably merit that in terms of, but then everything else on top of that, you earn maybe incrementally in terms of your image rights and everything else you earn outside of the game. I don't know how it would work, mate, but go on, you were going to make a point.
Well, I'm going to make a point that, if you look at going back to Nicholas Jackson, for example, Nicholas Jackson, 70 million quid. 70 million quid for a guy who, let's face it, didn't tear up any trees at Chelsea last season. He scored a few goals, missed more than he scored, etc. He's 70 million quid to buy. His wages are astronomical, but they can only afford to do that, can't they, when the part of something bigger where the money is available. They're creating more money, creating more wealth, using that wealth to artificially inflate pricing. But also, if Chelsea had wanted rid of Nicholas Jackson, because of the multi-club ownership, for example, that they're involved, they could have easily just written that off, couldn't they? And they write it off across. Yeah. Seem to write it off across the group. I'm probably wrong. They have to write it off again across Chelsea, but it just seemed like there's so much money moving sideways, left and right, upside and downside, whatever. It just goes back to that phrase we used earlier, the murky world of it, really. But I think the salary cap has got lots of challenges to implement, and obviously there's probably, like say, HR law saying you can't restrict someone's earnings capacity. But let's face it, the average football going fan wouldn't be averse to saying, well, I'm sorry, you can only earn 200 grand a week. We feel a bit sorry for you, kind of thing.
I know it's one of those, isn't it? I mean, a player could turn around and say, but if a club makes X in a year, and I'm an integral part of that club making X a year, then I deserve what I make because I've generated that club all of this money. The likes of Messi and Ronaldo, just in shirt deals and everything else alone, they could probably say, well, we earned that money because the club's probably making X. And so my 52 million a year is probably cheap at the price because I'm making the club 300 million or something like that. So that might be how they justify it. I mean, in terms of the players, I mean, yeah, it does. I'm all for it, mate. Really, because I don't really think there's to your point. Poor me, I can only earn 200 grand a week there. Oh, boo hoo. It's elite sports now. It's such a world where you can earn so much money. But if you're good at what you do, and I think that should, for me, a salary cap would also perhaps encourage players to be at the top of their game. Because maybe if you had a salary cap, but then you could earn more in terms of, well, the more you play, the better you play, your image rights will be more. You'll earn more from your image rights, and you're free to negotiate whatever sponsorship deals you want outside of that, which is their right to do, and rightly the club have no control over. but for me, I would agree with it because it's where does it all stop? You know, salaries are slowly rising and creeping up all the time, and players want more and more and more. And you've got very average players now on 100 grand a week, 150 grand a week.
Yeah.
And it's like, if you look at that over a season and over a contract, it's huge. That's huge money. And do they really absolutely earn that? I'd probably say some of them do, but a lot of them don't.
No.
They don't.
And going to where it's going to end up with the elite being a bigger gap between the
Yeah,
elite. And, will we ever see a Leicester City again? Probably not. That was a generational, it was a once in many lifetime situation, little Leicester as they would be called in that respect, winning the Premier League and quite rightly so. But I just think the bigger clubs are getting bigger. If you look at Liverpool's spending in the summer, their argument would be we didn't spend anything in the summer before, but over 2 summers, and then Arsenal, and then you look at City and you look at Chelsea, they've all got money coming in from all sorts of places, some of which is multi-club ownership. The reality of it is, I don't like the fact that we don't know how it works properly. And I think the average football fan just sees it as a little bit seedy, a little bit grubby, a little bit kind of grey. And all I'd like is a bit more transparency. And I'd like it to be absolutely categorically clear that it's one club as part of a group, but that club is an individual club. Otherwise, the group thing is the bit where Ben Chilwell gets transferred. Is there an incentive? We get players coming from clubs within the group on loan suddenly from nowhere, or we get them signing for a club for an inflated fee so the club that's selling them get a better number on their books, and it just feels all wrong. Don't get me wrong, I wouldn't want to go back to what we started off with. I wouldn't want to be going down the Pozzo model of saying, well, Watford are run like this because Udinese are run like this. It started off at Udinese. Udinese were a club in turmoil. Watford have been up and down, up and down, up and down. I'd hate that. I don't think there's a place in the current financial setup for local chairman, and I'll take Borough as an example, as a finishing argument, right? Okay, when we were in our prime in the Premier League and we were signing the likes of Janino and Ravanelli and Emerson and the likes, Steve Gibson would have probably been in the top 5 richest chairmen in the Premier League. We were paying big wages for big global superstars, and if we'd have stayed up with that 3-point deduction against Blackburn and it hadn't happened, we'd stayed up. That might have been a catalyst for us being a really steady or progressive Premier League club. It all fell apart when we got relegated after one season. However, Steve Gibson would have been a rich man in the Premier League in 96, 97, 98 kind of era. If we go up this season, and let's face it, we've started really well, it's very early, but, let's say we get promoted this season, Steve Gibson will be a pauper by comparison to virtually every other club in that division on a financial footing, and that's where the gap becomes almost unbreachable. And that's why, for the last 2 seasons, the 3 clubs coming up have gone straight back down. Don't get me on parachute payments, that's a separate podcast altogether. But it's moved the game, hasn't it, in 30 years, and it's just getting wider and bigger and murkier, and that's what I'd like to end on.
And I think I would say is, you could argue, and if you looked at it historically, you could argue, well, going back to the time when the likes of Steve Gibson owned the club, Jack Walker owned Blackburn, Jack Hayward owned Wolves. Again, I can't remember his name, but the guy who owned Derby back in the 70s, people might look at that and say, well, the multi-club ownership and how big these companies are now, it's just a modern day version of what they were doing, because, these were rich people who decided to buy a football club and use their money to make them bigger than everyone else and try and win everything. So you could argue it's just a much bigger, modern day, more sophisticated way of what was happening in the 70s, 80s, 90s. I'd say I don't think it is as like that. I think that was a bit more cut and dried. It was just basically someone who made money, owned a club. It was more transparent, but it still had the same. They were still trying to do the same thing, weren't they? Which was to use their money to make their club bigger and be successful. Yeah. But it wasn't. It was nowhere near as murky and as confusing as it is now. But yeah, some people might say it's just how a modern evolution. Where will we be in 50 years' time? It's going to come to a head, I think, mate, where all of a sudden someone's going to have to sit around and say, enough. We need to go back to, you know, having your traditional club owned in such a way, or even if you're owned by someone who owns other clubs, it's got to be structured in such a way that they can't affect each other, or there's I just think it's a worrying that where does it all spiral to? Where does it all go? And I think the Premier League and governing bodies are starting to see that in terms of how they're struggling to manage it.
What worries me about where it goes is it goes outside of UEFA and FIFA. They set their own leagues up, and it's called a Super League because
Yeah,
the clubs with the
yeah.
money don't give a shit about regulation. They don't give a shit about UEFA, FIFA, and I think they will just at some point reinvent the Super League with no regulation from. It's a little bit like saying there's a weird athletics tournament going on. Uh, I think right now where they're saying that anyone can compete irrespective if you take drugs or not.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So this is almost like saying, but irrespective of how murky you are, if we're all murky and we're all in it together, let's just create a murky league and we'll call it a super league and we'll just go off and do our own thing. And by the way, that athletics and swimming championship, that's the thin end of the wedge, isn't it? Oh yeah,
Oh,
just
I looked at is it Ben Proud the swimmer? Is he Ben Proud? He's called. Correct
yeah,
me if I've got the wrong name there. But it was a swimmer who's caused a bit of controversy because he's basically said I can earn more in this tournament than I would probably earn the rest of my life in swimming. But I was listening to that and thinking, does that mean he takes a drug to elevate himself to a more powerful standard?
yeah,
I just looked at that and thought, yeah, I was with you, mate. I was like, what does that encourage moving forward? We're trying to discourage stuff like that, and now we're promoting games and competitions where you can earn a huge amount of money and do what the hell you like. But then, as a sportsman, you're then signing up for that, knowing that you can't then go back to where you were before. You've
yeah.
just ruined all of that. You've probably ruined a legacy and everything that goes with it.
But there's my final point, mate. I think ultimately the multi-club owners, the countries, the oil billionaires and whatever, and the Americans in particular, don't really care because they've got no skin in the heritage game, the legacy game. I think if it means that they can make more money, they will create at some point. I think the end game is they'll create a super league where everyone has got they can do what they want. There's no financial control. Whoever's got the money can buy what they want, do what they want. There's no regulations from UEFA or FIFA because they've probably they've probably pulled themselves away from that kind of regulation, and then let them go and do that. If they do that, I think funnily enough, football might just be a bit better at grassroots level, but
Oh, it will be.
the
Yeah,
lack of money at grassroots level, although it doesn't really filter down, and they say it does, but it's bullshit. I think football would be more pure, and I'd like to finish on pure football versus murky football, and that's my final point. What do you reckon?
yeah. I would agree with that. I would echo that. I I think that where it sadly is where it's going. But I also would like to point out that rich owners could do things very differently if they wanted to. I
Mm.
think if you, regardless how rich you are, you could do something just for the sheer value of what it is and the integrity of what it is rather than the money side of it. So all these owners could come in and buy a club, and I'd have no issue with it if they then ran it exactly how your football club should be run.
Yeah,
And there's nothing wrong with wanting to, you know, create awareness around the world, etc., etc. But if it was just run, and the governance of it was in place, that it was run the way a football club should be run, purely for its community and all the things that go with that,
mm.
I'd have no issue with it. Um, and maybe that will have to come in at some point, whether they'll be able to or not. I don't think they will because these clubs are too powerful and rich and strong to let that happen. But sadly, I just don't see. I don't understand why owners can't do that and won't do that, because surely it's about valuing the sport that you're investing in, and it's the integrity of the sport, not the money. But then we're just normal fans, mate. We're not owners. But it
Nah,
always mystifies me, mate. Because if I was an owner and I was in that, maybe it's when you maybe it's to make that kind of money, you have to be a different kind of person, and you're not as passionate about stuff like that. But I'd like to think if that was me, I'd be going in it for the right reasons. So Yeah.
You're a lovely bloke. You're not a ruthless man. You'll never be a multi-zillionaire as a result of not being a
No, I'm
ruthless
not
man,
money
Dom.
orientated, mate. That's the thing, and it's I'm more into. I just value what these things actually are, and I just wish rich owners. It's like I don't really think they appreciate how lucky they are that they get to become custodians of these amazing
Yeah.
clubs, whether it be football, rugby, basketball, NFL. But then do the right thing by that club and that community and the values and the history of the game.
Okay. On that, we'll leave the episode.
Yeah,
We've talked about murkiness. It's an area that Dom and I would readily admit we're not experts on, but from a fan point of view, hopefully we've given you our insight into what makes us a little bit worried, a little bit skeptical, a little bit nervous. So that's been episode 13. On next week's episode 14, we're going to challenge the question: is football more boring now than it was 10 or 15 years ago? And we'll cover that next time out. There's a lot of people who would agree with it. A lot of people might not agree with it. We'll decide. We'll have a discussion on that. But for those who are watching, listening, viewing, etc., please don't forget to subscribe. Give us a like. Give us a share on your favourite platforms. We're on all the usual podcast platforms. We're obviously on YouTube as well. But a real like or a share would be great. There's a group on LinkedIn just called the Half and Half Scarf Football Podcast with Nick and Dom. Just search that and join the LinkedIn group if you can. There's some exclusive content goes into there from time to time. But other than that, Dom, thanks again for being a great co-host on episode 13 of the Half and Half Scarf Podcast. Can't believe we got to that one already. Andy Newbold.
I can't believe it, mate. Yeah, it's been a pleasure, mate, as always. Loved it, and I'll see you on the next one.
Cheers.